I wanted to just take a second to talk about PC Gamer. They are a massive, well, company that have been making reviews for games for the last better part of 2 decades. However, what I did want to talk about is their incredibly out-of-touch Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 review. Just to give you a bit of an example, they started off as a 60 out of 100. Don't know what they use that as their gaming, but a 6 out of 10 essentially. It is an incredible title that deserves way more than that, but it's not just the fact that it got a 6 out of 10. It's that, well, PC Gamer have an impressive track record of reviews. Do you remember Golem? Yep, that got 62 out of 100. So better than Space Marine 2. Suicide Squads, we got 67 out of 100. Star Wars Outlaws, 73 out of 100. All I've seen is terrible games, and oh my god, it's awful. And then Skull and Bones got 68 out of 100, a title that I have played so long. And I do hate that game. It is awful. But it's still got 8 more points than Space Marine 2 did. Which begs the question, who's playing this game? Who are they getting to review it? Well, Robin Valentine is the one that did this review on the September the 4th. So I thought, hey, how has it been given 60 out of 100? Let's at least give them a chance to see what they've got to say. Maybe they've had just a different experience to me. However, well, it starts to get a little bit rough. So they talk about the 8-hour single-player campaign for Space Marine 2 and really hark on the fact that it is a whole new level of spectacle. It feels huge, authentic, and visually sumptuous. But the sad truth is that I was tired of playing it before those 8 hours were even up. Okay, interesting opening. It's right, this game is absolutely gorgeous. And in fact, I've said this so many times in my early reviews, and even just playing it with mates, I think it has to be one of the best looking games I've ever seen. They touch on the fact that it was made by Saber Interactive with their swarm tech that really was perfected in World War Z, having the Tyranids climb on top of each other to get in certain sections, and actually it does form a good part of the gameplay mechanics because, well, seeing the Tyranids swarm on top of each other to get up to the platforms isn't just that it looks cool, but also it kind of filters out enemies. So whilst, yes, there are thousands of people on the screen, you only actually have to fight a few at a time, and it's a good way of sort of creating that limitation and building it up and up and up, depending on your difficulties. Then the most important part. PC Gamer says for your first couple of hours of fights, it looks and feels awesome, but unfortunately, it's not long before the cracks beginning to show. Interesting. Okay, so what are these cracks? The result is you're constantly sprinting between flashing red flows to see the same canned animations over and over. Talking about the executions. Your 2 AI companions will even stun enemies for you and leave them while you finish it off, but it meant that it was kind of absurd moving between these executables in order to get them, which I think is a point to really hark towards. However, I don't really think that's the main point of the combat. The majority, 99.999% of it, is hacking and slashing through smaller enemies. You, of course, are a huge Space Marine. You're an Astartes, and not just that, but you are one of the more powerful in their prime, who has had centuries and centuries of practice and experience, and you can tell that. That's something that the game does absolutely fantastically, as Titus, well, he's over 150 years old and has been serving for the Emperor for a good amount of that time. And because of it, he is so combat experienced that none of these smaller Tyranids really stand a chance. It's pretty much one hits for everything. It's only the warriors and anything above that that really can be executed in a big way. Now, of course, you have the flashing indicators, of course, when enemies jump at you, that turn blue when you can catch them or do a counter, or turn red when you've got to dodge them. This is actually something that is indicated through the PC Gamer review, saying that it doesn't really make sense because it kind of feels like the inconsistencies are too much for the flashing indicators. The timing windows are giant, while others aren't telegraphed at all and easily missed in the crush, which I can partly agree with. The timing windows being large for the little blue flashing lights for you to be able to catch someone in midair and take them down or do some sort of counter, I think is very intentional, because at the end of the day, it's meant to be a cinematic piece for the player. You can take tons of damage from these lads because you are an Astartes, as I've already prefaced. The fact that you can do these takedowns is purely for the player's excitement and enjoyment, and something that is incredibly satisfying to do. Whilst you're charging through countless enemies, you see that little flash come up and you're like, quick, hit C, and you're able to get a kill in just to try and break up the pacing of the combat somewhat. And it does break up that pacing, adding in little pauses through it because no other enemies can hit you during that. Now, the second part of that I do somewhat agree with is the fact that some enemies will just hit you and no window to block and parry. Now, you can obviously block and parry them, but once you're surrounded by 6 or 7 Tyranids, it's very unlikely you're actually going to see them doing their smaller attacks. But these pretty much do nothing, and that's kind of part it. The whole reason that you have these Tyranids versus Space Marines is it's death by 1,000 cuts. They're not supposed to be big hitters, so they should be able to get some hits in there. But the mechanic is in order to facilitate one of the main other combat mechanics, and this is your armor and health bars. Armor bars that can be rebooted by the executions. They would be completely unnecessary if every single attack by the enemy was widely indicated. There'll be no level of difficulty, and therefore, one, no fun within the game, and no reason for the armor boosts, and of course the health packs later on. Not just the whole point of the executions rely on the enemies being able to cause other types of damage to you, but if every single attack by an enemy could be so easily countered, it essentially makes the game pointless. Now, they then go on to talk about how the executions are so powerful and they do focus around melee content. But that conclusion for this seems very odd to me, and this is when I start to have sort of, well, suspicions that maybe our friend Robin is playing on perhaps the easiest difficulty. And don't get me wrong, that's absolutely fine. I think anybody can play any game on whatever difficulty they want. However, if you are reviewing a game for such a big website as PC Gamer and such a big launch as Space Marine, you should probably play this game to its fullest potential, which is, well, what you should be getting out of just the regular difficulty or even the harder difficulties, because you get so much more out of the game if you have an experience within games like this. And if you don't have an experience within games like this, I'm not sure you should be reviewing a title like Warhammer Space Marine 2. I don't know, that's just my opinion, but I think if you're playing it on very much the easiest difficulties, it's probably because these are not the type of games that you are experienced in. I'm not sure why you are doing this review, however. And the reason I've come to this conclusion is because these executions have been performed at melee range, so they're vital for staying alive. This is a good point. Then PC Gamer goes on to conclude, long-range combat is therefore largely pointless, despite the array of scoped weapons that cater for it. And equally, the various close-range guns have little use either. I don't know if I've ever been more baffled by a point. Anybody that has played Space Marine 2 knows how much you use weapons within this. Okay, melee weapons are fun to use to get in the grinder, but really, especially if you're playing at any sort of difficulty other than the easiest, they are kind of a last resort as you start to get into the later missions, or at least mid-game and later game, because the enemies start becoming so thick and powerful that you can't just chop through all of them. Even the smaller enemies swarm in such huge numbers later on. You need to be getting through your bolt gun ammo and then your bolt pistol ammo, and then once they're all spent with the clips, then you can bring out the melee. Then once you manage to melee the rest of the stragglers, you can then reload. And then when you get even to the later games and you're fighting against the Thousand Suns, bigger bosses, bigger enemies, you need to use every bit of firepower you have, especially fighting against things like brutes or any sort of bosses within this game. Melee combat is so difficult. I mean, fighting against the Tyranid bosses within this game, you have to do at range because they provide so much firepower onto you as a player that getting close to them is so risky unless they're already stunned. And this just kind of strikes to me that either they didn't get to these stages in the game, which I'd rather not assume because they do actually talk about the later game within this review, but maybe they just played it on such an easy difficulty that they're able to take down these guys. So I don't know. Is it just me, or was this game almost impossible to play melee only? And having to use not just, a lot of gunplay, but almost exclusively towards the latter portions of the game and only really reserving your melee for the weaker enemies, as getting things like the Terminators down to low health enough to execute them, you needed things like your bolt guns, your melters, as I'll get onto, your multi-melters, and of course your sniper rifles, as we'll get onto in a little bit, because they also say this about the close range guns, and I think the melter is the most significant one within this game, which is a gun that I use time and time again because it is so powerful. Yet even towards the latter half and the last few missions of Space Marine 2, you still need to go through a whole clip, then get out your pistol, get a few shots in there, then do a few melee strikes before you're able to get executions on some of the harder enemies. That gun is so strong, and yet it needs to be used strategically. Yet it is so important towards killing these enemies because you're just going in with melee fights. As mentioned, the parrying and blocking can be quite tricky if you're playing it on harder difficulties towards the end of the game. So actually just taking out Thousand Suns purely in melee will be quite tricky. Taking out some of these bosses purely in melee will be almost impossible. So I'm completely baffled where this point comes from, that ranged combat is not useful within the game. I mean, there's a mission where you work with a flamethrower, which is incredibly fun. And, well, you have to do ranged combat with this. But this kind of states to the point that you can't get away with this game without using a significant amount of ranged firepower. And I think the melee system is built perfectly for it, especially the point they made earlier about not every attack from the enemy having indicators of when to parry, meaning that you are going to take damage if you just sit in melee for too long. You need to get back, rest, recuperate, and do some firing from the back, take in some stim packs, and make sure your armor has been replenished through the few executions, whilst you then provide firepower from the back of your allies using all these guns. There is such a big place for ranged combat, and I think even more so than any of the melee combat. But hey, I guess I'm being disagreed with here by Robin. I say the whole combat system is simply messy in this way. It feels like the developer iterated on it several times but forgot to go back and delete their old work, so multiple clashing ideas set jumbled together. Now, they do say that they like how Titus feels really like a juggernaut in this game, and he really does, especially with things like the Thunder Hammer. It's very fun to use, and I personally love the progression of weapons that you can use. They do say that the campaign is refreshingly focused with no leveling systems, unlock, or side missions, which I would agree with. However, I think that they managed to dynamically integrate leveling systems within it. You unlock things like jump packs, you unlock things like newer weapons like the power swords or the Thunder Hammer or things like the multi-melter as you move through. And in fact, there are unlocks with the weapons that you can spawn with. Pretty much any weapon within the game you can find around the levels as you move through the missions. Of course, things like the Thunder Hammer only really come apparent in the final missions, but they can be unlocked and then used to spawn with at later dates. This is not necessarily entirely true, and it kind of makes me think that they haven't played too much of Space Marine 2, at least after or outside of the initial missions, because there's a whole lot of character customization within this. You can pick a variety of loadouts, and you can find drop pods where you can change these loadouts throughout each of the missions. Maybe you want to play with a multi-melter and a bolt pistol, maybe you want to play with a plasma incinerator and a plasma pistol, or maybe you just want to play as a sniper from the back. You can do this, and you can customize it through each mission using these drop pods and, of course, the customization menus at the battle barge. The fact that they say there is no leveling system, unlocks, or side missions, even despite them saying it as a positive, makes me wonder how much has actually been played, because there are unlocks. There just is. They go on to positively talk about, well, Saber Interactive's attention to detail with the Warhammer 40k lore, and that's one of the biggest points. I think there was so much in terms of details and Easter eggs and things that if you know Warhammer 40k that are so glorious. There is one mission that I think is incredibly flawed, and this is the one where you get a jump pack in space and you have to fly through into a planet. Look, it's only the start of a mission, and it's just basically you don't really have to do anything. You're pretty much on rails. But it gets to the point where there's huge spectacles by the end, and, well, I just remember playing the last mission with my mates, seeing the bit where Titus is holding up the flag, or sorry, the captain's holding up the flag, or where you go into the portal, into the warp, and I mean, it is one of the most incredible set pieces that I've played, and one of the coolest crescendos as well. I think it's gorgeous. And, well, this is where PC Gamer kind of lost me. The third act leaves with nothing to do but to try and escalate all the fighting and shouting and apocalyptic threats even higher and higher. Although the visuals are mostly impressive enough to back it up, it does start to feel like a lot of noise, which is kind of baffling for a Warhammer 40k game. That is exactly it. It's not helped by the increasing shift and focus over the course of the game from the Tyranids to the Chaos, specifically the Thousand Suns worshippers of the god of magic and scheming Zinch. It's just got to change, actually. Compared to the utterly alien Tyranids, this dark culture offers a more understandable foe, but their plans are frustratingly underbaked. And in the game with so many surprisingly nuanced details, its key villains are oddly two-dimensional. This is Warhammer 40k, okay? I think the Warhammer 40k lore is so gorgeously in-depth, but there are so many stories going on that actually there is so many tiny little bits and details that you can pick up within this. Yet, at the end of the day, the powers of chaos, and specifically Zeech, their whole goal is to turn you to their side. It is literally within the name of the god. So the fact that there is a complaint that it's okay when it's not quite Thanos here, or why isn't it like the Joker? Why isn't it surprisingly complex? I'm baffled that this is really a point. I mean, it's like going to Darth Vader and being like, why doesn't he care about the economy of the Empire? No, he doesn't give a fuck. He just wants to be the most powerful and overthrow the Emperor. He's not thought that far ahead. That's not his character. And this is not Warhammer 40k. With the Chaos specifically, well, it's called Chaos for a goddamn reason. And I'd like to argue the fact that the whole concoction that turns into the final battle against this animation of Zeech and, of course, the Sorcerer is one of the most Warhammer 40k things ever. It is chaotic, it is bloody, it is gory, and it is the most patriotic thing I've ever seen, with the Space Marines working together with the Dreadnoughts. I mean, that scene as the Dreadnought crashes through the wall and kills the Chaos Dreadnought doesn't get more Warhammer 40k than this, and it takes spectacle really over everything. That final boss battle isn't necessarily the most in-depth. There's a lot of repeated patterns, and it does evolve somewhat, trying to counter the new moves that these enemies bring out to you. But really what it's trying to do is show you the true scale of Warhammer 40k. And what it feels like is that, well, Robin, who went into this from PC Gamer, just wasn't quite sure at what he was expecting, because 40k is this. Space Marine 2 is almost the perfect encapsulation of what 40k is. And it went from fighting Tyranids on a city, on this planet, should I say, sorry, to fighting chaos gods and chaos demons. And there couldn't be anything more 40k. In fact, these days, that is the majority of 40k. The warp is so huge and goes so in-depth, and there is so much to explore there, that the Tyranids are the least worries of the Space Marines. In fact, the fact that they unveiled that there was a chaotic undertone to this was probably the least surprising thing that happened in Space Marine 2. Overall, I think it's just a poor review. I think the person that wrote it obviously didn't know too much about Warhammer 40k, which, granted, is fair enough, but why are you doing a review on the Space Marine game? Second of all, they clearly didn't play anything more than just the missions. There's a little bit to touch on the multiplayer, which I actually mostly agree with. I think the multiplayer is kind of poor at the moment. There are a few issues with it, but I've got a full video coming on that soon. Yet, things like the game not being hard enough, the game being too focused on melee, the game not having customization and leveling up, is just not really true. And in fact, most of the issues that they're pointing out, with just a little bit more playtime and maybe a bit more attention paid to the little details and things that Space Marine 2 is trying to show you about the Warhammer universe, it was actually probably all iron itself out. But I'm going to leave the link in the description below to the PC Gamer review. But just be aware, they gave Gollum and Skull and Bones a higher review than this. Skull and Bones